So if we were to look back on 2019, can you remember that far back? With the rise of Greta and Extinction Rebellion, there were reasons for us to be confident that 2020 was going to be a breakthrough year for the environment. The Church of England held a conference for diocesan environmental officers from each of the 42 dioceses, and I attended that in Chester, and we received a year planner showing the anticipated world events, the UK events, the Church of England events, and key forums, and in particular the United Nations Conference on Biodiversity and COP26, the climate talks in Glasgow. There were huge things happening to look forward to in 2020. And in February, the DEOs met again at Lambeth Palace for the launch of the Archbishop of Canterbury's Lent book by Ruth Valerio, which I'm sure you all know, Saying Yes to Life. Just around the same time, the General Synod of the Church of England set new targets for all parts of the Church of England to work to become carbon net zero by 2030. And that was a huge event as well. Well, things were looking good. But then around the time of Cheltenham races, the coronavirus arrived from China and people started dying from COVID-19. Boris announced the first lockdown, and since then we've been living in strange times, to put it mildly. In early January, we normally wish one another a happy new year, but these words can sound quite hollow at the moment. Except that the Christian faith gives us assurance that God is still in charge of the universe, is with us through these struggles, and during what the Bible calls the last days, we can look forward to Jesus Christ returning to fully establish his kingdom here on earth. This is a counter narrative to the prevailing culture, and you don't hear much about this on the 6 o'clock news, for example, but we get plenty of stuff that can depress us. And so today's presentation is aiming to outline some of the events anticipated during 2021, as well as some issues that we might want to consider. Well, our time is limited, but you can use the links that are provided in the email to research some of this further if you so wish. Since the 1980s, the United Nations has had a set of Millennium Development Goals, which in 2015 became the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that they aim to achieve by 2030. At the core of the 2020 to 2030 decade is the need for action to tackle growing poverty, empower women and girls, and to address the climate emergency. And I think we can see from the outworking of this to some extent in the Gloucester Diocese Life Vision, which Cate has alluded to earlier. Well, we're all familiar with the science of climate change. However, the transition to a zero carbon world is going to be much more challenging than some would have us believe. I recently came across a book, the title of which is going to throw some of you into despair. The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. In this book, we have an argument that the majority of people lived in rural poverty or slavery for centuries until the Industrial Revolution, when the burning of coal and oil inside machinery had the effect of boosting living standards for billions of people. In our own lifetime, we've seen 250 million Chinese people leave the paddy fields and enjoy the benefits of steady jobs, better housing, and improved health. This book shows that fossil fuels are still vitally important to the global economy. Wind and solar, however much we love them, are unreliable and cause disruption to the national grid. So the transition to a zero carbon world by 2030 is going to need big advances in battery technology. I don't say this to depress us, I say this to be realistic. Moving on to the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, this is real. I know 40 people who've had COVID and 10 who've died. But there is growing evidence that the medical profession, government, and the news media have either exaggerated the threat or taken a sledgehammer to crack a nut. So far, COVID-19 has claimed 2 million lives worldwide, whereas 100 years ago, the Spanish flu infected 500 million people and killed 50 million, equivalent to almost the entire UK population. So to compare it in that context, I hope is helpful. Another thing that's hidden from general news is that the average age of death from COVID is still 82 years old with underlying health conditions. One wonders why, given the characteristics of this disease, the governments around the world didn't simply advise older people like myself to shield and let life carry on as normal for the vast majority. And where people got ill, why not put them into isolation hospitals rather than sticking them into the general hospitals? I could go on. Some people are finding different ways of coping with this pandemic. During the first lockdown, for example, I believed everything that the government was telling us through the BBC and newspapers. But then over the summer, doubts started to creep in. The government claimed to be following the science, but as Theresa May said in the House of Commons just before the second lockdown, Boris appears to be manipulating the statistics to justify his policies, which is, of course, the wrong way around. Donald Trump, who is leaving the White House today, is famous for referring to fake news. And social media is awash with these ideas, although we haven't got time to go into much of this today. But this brings me neatly on to a fascinating link between the global pandemic and an initiative by the World Economic Forum, most likely known to us as the annual Davos conference, where Greta had the platform and said, "I want you all to panic." From the title of this book, the World Economic Forum sees the pandemic as an opportunity for what they call the Great Reset. Their ambitions are available for anyone to read about on the internet, and they've been up there for at least 10 years. Whilst the news media are focusing on the pandemic, just behind this wave of suffering is an even bigger tsunami of disastrous poverty. Repeated lockdowns are destroying thousands of small businesses in the UK, and poverty on the scale of the Great Depression isn't that far off. The goals of the World Economic Forum appear to be similar to the United Nations, and about 6 months ago they signed a strategic partnership. However, the methods used by the World Economic Forum strike me as devious, and some people fear that it could be leading us into a totalitarian state similar to China. Well, the last 6 months has seen growing skepticism and distrust of Western governments. We need only look at Brexit and the recent riots on Capitol Hill in Washington, DC for evidence of this. And this morning's news reported that so many people have cancelled their licence fees that the BBC are having to restructure and consider making mass redundancies. People are instead turning to social media for their news and information, despite the difficulty of distinguishing truth from error. Agenda 21 is being linked to mass vaccination programs and allegations of a new world order that some of you, I'm sure, will find too fantastic to seriously entertain. Well, it's easy to dismiss all this as fantasy, but millions of people, including some of those in our pews on a Sunday morning and elsewhere, are taking these theories seriously. And the church, if we're going to be able to engage with these people, needs to take our head out of the sands and try and make sense of it. Well, if I had more time, I'd go into a few other remaining slides, such as Prince Charles's launch of the Terra Charter and the United Nations Nuclear Weapons Treaty, which is being celebrated tomorrow by the ringing of church bells all across the country. Because much as Ernest and some of us are worried about climate change, there is potential with nuclear weapons for everything to end in the next 24 hours. And it is very much part of our stewardship as Christians to try and work for peace. So I think I've probably said more than enough, other than to say that the Davos summit, which is going ahead virtually next week, may be happening physically in May in Singapore. And given everything I've just shared with you, I think it's something we need to keep tabs on, as well as to pray and look forward to the COP26 meeting in Glasgow on the 1st to the 12th of December.
So what I'm going to share with you is, it's based on some research that I did as part of my PhD. I'm a nearly complete PhD student at this point, so hopefully by the end of the year it'll be done and dusted, which will be nice. But this is a piece of work that I did with Stroud, looking at the pioneer ministry in Stroud. And basically exploring what they were doing, how they connect with green and environmental issues, and wider social responsibility concerns as it happens, and then doing some theological reflection on that, which might inform all of us in our work and in our ministry. And the overall vision that I want to share is really a Christian contribution that is significant beyond those who come to church. I think too often we think too small, and perhaps underplay the resources and the wisdom that there is within the Christian tradition, and how that can inform the whole conversation, and can be wisdom for many who are working on these things, are our partners in these concerns, who may never be signed up church-going Christians, but still can learn from the resources and from the wisdom. There are many people out there who are open to spiritual wisdom and spiritual resourcing. So I guess I've put images up there of salt and light. I think this is very much a kind of salt and yeast, I should say. I think this is the places where we get ourselves mixed in and amongst things that are happening within wider society, and that gives leaven and gives flavour to the whole. So this was a headline in the Observer in October 2018. So Extinction Rebellion is in the background of this, and this is when Extinction Rebellion was very much in the headlines, and this article was the gentle Cotswold town that spawned a radical protest. And some of the founders of Extinction Rebellion are Stroudies. So that's kind of what's behind the article. And I found myself writing about this rather by accident, because I'd chosen to go and explore what Simon was doing in Stroud. And this all happened at the same time. This is an extract from an interview that I did with Simon, which was 6 months or so before that headline. Before most of us had heard of Extinction Rebellion. So Simon was saying a lot of the guys are going on a march in November, the climate march. They won't be afraid to be arrested, they're fearless, all of this kind of thing. October 2018, none of us had heard of Extinction Rebellion. So I was listening to Simon talking about this, and then it all unfolded in the months to follow. So the question that we find ourselves bumping into is the spiritual needs of activists. The image that I've put up for you there is something that something called the solstice spiral. So the St Lawrence Church in Stroud, just before Christmas, lay out conifer branches in something of a labyrinth, and people can come and walk the labyrinth in the church, and with some thoughts, some prayers, using candle as symbolism, but doing it in a language and in a way that that is accessible if you're not used to the jargon that we tend to use in church. People relate to imagery of light and darkness and candles and hopes and fears as we leave one year and go into the next, and at the dark of the year, because this was the winter solstice. So I just put that up by way of an example of the kind of thing that they're doing there. In this quote, again from the interview with Simon, the sense that activists need a meditative side, and that they're feeling that it's part of their calling as a church to offer something which resources the activists that there are in the town, and not just the Christians, all of those who are engaged in the various kinds of activism. And I should say that by activists, I'm not just meaning Extinction Rebellion style activism. That's a very particular type of activism that is doing the political campaigning work. But actually all of us, I think, that are doing some kind of, pushing into the new in terms of environmental concerns, are activists in some way, whether what we're working with is the political conversations, or whether we're getting out our bow saws and our shovels and doing the practical conservation volunteering, or whether we're working with the churches on eco church, or it's all activism of a kind. So I'm using the word activism in that general sense rather than the more specific. But if I move on to this, there's a reminder of eco-anxiety and how burnout is a huge problem amongst green activists. And I think we can all know the reality of that we are faced with a huge challenge, and one that we can become very gloomy about, very negative about, that we struggle to work out how on earth we're going to get from A to B. And so the spirituality, the relationship with God, the relationship with the story of faith, it gives us a resourcing that helps us to keep going and protects us in a sense from that eco-anxiety that keeps us looking upwards, looking forwards, staying hopeful. But this article gives us the background in terms of the amount of burnout that there is amongst green activists, and eco-anxiety, which is not even limited to activists. That's around in the general population, in the people that haven't quite worked out what on earth they need to do to get started, let alone those who are trying and feeling frustrated. This slide is something from the American Psychology Association, and they have produced a 70-page document on mental health and climate change. Again, just by way of an indication of how seriously this is taken in society in general, and therefore how important spiritual resources are, and how important it is for us as churches to be thinking about what we can offer to the conversation, to resource people, to encourage, to inspire, to give people a solid basis in some ways to be working out of. So as I see it, and as I saw it worked out in the work in Stroud, I see two sides to the Christian contribution to the conversation. One is the spirituality itself, and the way that as we are refreshed and renewed in our relationship with God, or as outside the church, we might talk about our connection to the divine life, or some perhaps slightly more general language, but we're talking about the same thing. We're talking about relationship with God and connection with the divine and the source of all life and the source of all love. So that is significant, and it does resource us, and it does make a difference to whether we are able to keep going when we're feeling frustrated at times and struggling to feel, keeping pushing forwards when it's not straightforward. The other side of it is the bigger story in terms of what God has done and is doing, that we are a part of. And that one, I'll come back to that in a little bit, but that one's perhaps a little more complicated in terms of how we express that in terms of wider society, because there are other competing stories around. And yet, it is a powerful resource. So I'll just leave that thought and come back to that in a little bit. So spirituality for activists, I've got an image there from something happening. They do a thing that they call the Cowshed service in St Lawrence Church, which is a monthly thing. And you get the sense of how it works. Just a open, reflective, contemplative in a circle, so contributions from all kinds of people, this discussion more than sermon, and people participating in that service that wouldn't come to anything else that that the church would offer. So it has a very particular audience to it, and the approach that they take is to have an integrity about being Christian, but an openness in terms of who participates and perhaps the use of language and how things are expressed. Theology, but not just for Christians. This one is really tricky, isn't it? Because if we're wanting to offer hope to the whole conversation and not just to signed up church Christians, and knowing the variety of backgrounds that our partners in this work come from, we are in a situation in society where that the reality is pluralism, religious pluralism. We can't assume that everybody is signed up to the same story of life as we are, I guess the traditional way of churches going at this is to encourage people to make a Christian commitment, to be a signed up Christian, if I can put it that way, and then to speak with those people about what environmentalism then means within Christian faith. I think I'm wanting to encourage us to think about doing it a bit backwards and inside out, if I can put it that way, and if we work from the outside in and express some of our Christian wisdom in the wider conversation, to find times when we can say, you know, that the tradition that I represent or that I live in has this to say, and I wonder if this might be helpful for this situation or this this challenge that we're up against, and just share that wisdom and see where it gets us, see where the conversations get us. And some of the people that we're sharing with actually might want to explore more deeply within the Christian tradition. Others won't, but might be resourced from that wisdom, and that's a good, and that helps us, because we have this huge challenge against us, and we need to be working with all the resources that we have in front of us, and we have this resource in terms of the Christian wisdom. But we're not the only ones with something to say. Oh, I've got a boat of Newbiggin. I don't know how many of you have read this, an absolute classic from Leslie Newbiggin, about how Christianity plays itself out in a plural, religiously plural society. And he's talking about being saved, being to do with the part that we're playing in God's story, and the story of God being the one that takes us into the future of what God has done and is doing and will do with the whole of creation. So salvation with that broad sense to it, and understanding the calling of Christians within that, but that we have partners as well. So it's good that we have confidence in our wisdom for the conversation, and courage to speak into the conversation, but we don't want to be doing it with arrogance. We don't want to be kind of coming in with that sense that we have all of the answers, and everybody needs to listen to us. And then Macy and Johnstone, the background there is Joanna Macy is Buddhist, and Johnstone is works on psychology of resistance, and they talk about the difference between passive hope and active hope. Passive hope that just waits for something to happen, and active hope which is involved in making that hope happen. So I just throw those in really by way of examples of the other wisdom that is out there, and the wisdom that we learn from, and that we offer our stuff into the conversation, and others offer theirs, and it all goes into the melting pot in order to find the wisdom that we need to move forward to our goals of keeping the temperature, that extra half a degree below. To get to our net zero by 2030, all of these things that we are trying to do, we come together on this. Right, where am I going next? Okay, so this is a Jim Wallace. Some of you may know Jim Wallace, and he's talking about finding the common ground and the importance of doing things together as much as we possibly can. And I'm coming towards the end now. This is the big one, really, in terms of our contribution to the conversation. Just this sense that God has not and will not let go of creation. That however much we mess up as humanity, God will find a way. And this... the promised future kingdom of God, or the eschatology, if you like your long words, the future is achieved in one sense, kind of through cross and resurrection, and we're still working it out, and we're messing it up considerably along the way, but God will not let go of what God has made. So we have a different angle on hope, which I think makes a difference to how we look at things. A couple of others who've picked up, Tom Wright picks up on this in this book, Surprised by Hope, and talks a lot about how Christian hope has become a very individual concern in many of our churches. So we talk about the Christian hope for an individual. We don't talk so much about the Christian hope for society and all creation. And yet that is the biblical perspective. It's not just about individuals, it's about the whole of all that God has made. And Walter Brueggemann, I've got a little more in another slide here. He goes into the exilic prophets and looks at what they had to say within the very difficult situations in which they found themselves, and how that gave new life to the communities that they were speaking to. So Jeremiah, he talks about the importance of letting go in order to move on and discover the new, the place of lament as the key to the process of letting go, and the importance of facing the lament, facing the sadness, facing the doubt, the worry. He's known as being a bit of a depressive, isn't he, Jeremiah? So face that stuff, and then we can take a deep breath and move on. But if we try really hard not to look at it, then at some point the burnout will hit us. Ezekiel talks about the importance of righteous living, how impossible it is to live well, to live right without drawing close to the source. So that takes us back into the spirituality question, that getting this stuff right without the spiritual connection to resource and to give us the new heart that Ezekiel speaks of. Isaiah, memory and story as resource to take us into the future. And I talked about that a little already, in fact, from Rebecca Solnit, the sense from Isaiah that people accepted bad situations because they could see no alternatives. And so storytelling about alternative possibilities and the power of storytelling about alternative possibilities. So I have 2 more slides. This one just to bring us back to the beginning. So spirituality for activists, that we need the spirituality, and we need to connect into the story and the story of God that offers us hope. And I end on this last one, just aspects of the story of God that resource us and that give us hope. And this last slide, in a sense, was just a bit of a, get some stuff out of my head. We could have a conversation about what other aspects of the Christian story have a value. But God will not let go of creation. Humanity doesn't need to die out for ecology to stabilise. We've probably all heard that sense within green circles that once humanity dies out, then the rest of creation will sort itself out. But the Christian tradition tells us that we don't need to die out. We just need to step into our calling. We need to learn to live right, learn to live in a better relationship with the natural world, and that we have a part to play. That God's at work too. It's not just dependent on what humanity can do. We're participating in God's work. It's not all on our shoulders. The paradox of dying to live, of letting go, the seed that dies in order to rise to new life. All of the wisdom in the nature parables. And that thread that runs through the whole of Christianity, that we don't chase success and endless growth. We let go in order to thrive, and there's wisdom in that for how we think about our conversations about new ways of being society which are better. Moving into these green, more ethical ways of living. We're not asking people to be Puritans that let go of all of the things that they love to do and live a miserable life. We're asking people to let go in order to discover new and better ways in which we thrive. And that sense of dying to live runs through that. Community, reconciliation, starting from the margins. How many of the people that God called were too young or too old, or the wrong ethnicity, or female, in a culture which didn't celebrate that, all of these kinds of things. And so how we then examine what's going on at the margins in our society and wonder where God might be at work there. And I've referred to the prophetic tradition through Brueggemann's work there. So that's where I leave us, and a real encouragement to be confident in what the Christian tradition can offer to the wider conversation, to be humble, not to be arrogant about it, to know that there's wisdom coming from other places as well, but at the same time to know and to celebrate and to speak as appropriate with our partners and in the conversations around us. So I'm going to stop screen sharing so that I can now see everybody again.
Giving what we haven't got. I think our main resource is in our own prayer, in our own liturgical life, in our own aware of the numinousness. There's no mention at all of the sacraments in what you've said. Seems to me a very important element of our sacramental life.
And there's only so much I can say in 20 minutes, so we could have a whole other conversation about the sacraments, and that of course is part of Christian spirituality. It's more complicated if we're wanting to offer Christian spirituality to a wider group, then not starting with the sacraments has it's almost it's a stepping stone along the way, and it's a place to start, which can offer resources to people. So yes, I think finding that gentleness to our approach. We really wind people up when we're preachy, I think some of us, because we're so wary of being preachy, end up holding back completely and not saying anything at all because we're so scared of being preachy. And I know I feel that in myself, because I so don't want to be preachy that I end up not sharing what actually could be useful wisdom for people. So I'm just encouraging us to kind of work at that and see if we can find the way that we can share humbly, and learn and have conversations and just see where it takes us. Martin.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. I mean, in Cam and Dursley, churches together make a real point of working in partnership with other community organisations. So, over Christmas, we did Friends at Christmas with something called GL11 Community Hub. And Bishop Rachel came along and said how much she valued that kind of partnership working. So there's something about not being other, but being the same with other people in the community. And so I'm a representative on Cam and Dursley Climate Action Network. And again, so I started posting things on their website from a kind of Christian or a faith perspective. And, and that's very much valued, I think. As you say, it is definitely about not being preachy, but just kind of speaking the same language and helping people see that, we are driven by faith, but actually we're kind of all on the same page.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I think it's because in society with conversations about faith are just a bit awkward, aren't they? And wouldn't it be lovely if we could have faith conversations at the same level as we have conversations about I don't know, our favourite sport, and I love cycling, and that's genuine. That's not an example that I do love cycling, and I don't get running at all. But I can have a conversation with somebody about how the fact that I love cycling and they love running, and I guess I long for us to be able to have faith conversations at that sort of level. Ernest.
I just want to pick you up on that and say, in this context, our favourite sport is looking after creation. So in other words, we've got lots in common with those other groups that are trying to do that. My issue is we shouldn't be going in too strongly on the faith side of it. That should come from the way we do the things we do with them, rather than preaching to them things. So my worry about the whole of this was that you talked about activists and you talked about our ambitions to do things and so on. We need to be yeast. We need to be out there enthusing and getting in with the issues. We're not there to sort of teach other people how to cope with it all. I don't think. I think that's a secondary part from my point of view. I'm always anxious that we don't seem to be doing enough fast enough, and we're too easily satisfied with looking back and saying, well, we're doing all right, aren't we? Look, I know there's virtue in looking back at where you've come from, but you've got to look forward to where we've got to get to and how quickly, because otherwise we're just comforting people while the thing's going down the pan. So I'm sorry, that's where I am.
Yeah, no, that's I actually hear you, and in some ways don't disagree. But I'm conscious that with that sense of burnout amongst green activists, if we can offer some hope that helps people to keep going, then I just don't want us throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and being so much wanting to put faith stuff on the back burner that when we could help, I don't even like the word help actually, because that can be a bit patronizing, but when we have there's a gift to offer, let's offer it. even if it's just a word here and there, and there's a suggestion that connecting with something bigger than ourselves can help with this, because it does.
I think yes, I completely agree. I don't want to sound as I'm totally against what you're saying. I do believe there is this particular Christian message towards this that is helpful and a way of looking at things. But I also think that we encourage people that are despairing by showing positive things that we can do, and we're on your side and we're with you, and let's get on with it, rather than, oh yes, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
I think we're actually in agreement, really. It's that's where we start. We start with the doing, and we start with being who we are, and we start with kind of modeling some spiritual resourcing in how we go about things, and then just not be shy to have a conversation if it's appropriate.
Please go ahead, Daniel. You're first one up.
Right. Well, thank you, Arthur, and thank you, Cate. It strikes me that both of you have brought out the idea of hope in the midst of this. And Cate, I truly appreciate what you said about the burnout, and maybe it's not necessarily always burnout as much as perhaps a sense of despair. And certainly I have experienced that. I'm sure many of you have. When you read about these world events, whether it's the things that Arthur's been describing, or whether it's extinction of species, or whether it's the advent of pollution and development in areas that used to be reserved for wildlife, and the loss of biodiversity. I mean, it sends us into a spiral of despair, and I really appreciate how you brought out hope as something that we as Christians have to offer. Now, I do agree that there are secular reasons to hope as well. There are a lot of good things that you can point to, sustainable energies and all that. And so I'm not to put that aside, but as a Christian, I really find my hope in the sort of thing that you said, Cate, about God will not let go of his creation, and that gives me hope, as does my expectation of Christ's return, and that no matter how bad things get, that is part of God's plan, that God has a narrative moving us into new creation, and that he's not going to let go of this creation. And so even within the circumstances that we find ourselves in, as dire as it gets, that hope is still there for us as Christians. And I think, well, it's hard for me to imagine where non-Christians find that kind of hope. As I said, yes, there are reasons to hope in terms of what's going on, and movements and activism and all these events that are trying to build changes. But at the same time, they're equally devastating events that are just having the opposite effect. I don't really have a question here, just kind of a comment on hope and the importance of that we have that to offer as Christians. And it sort of reminds me of the disciples on the Emmaus Road. They were downcast and filled with despair, and their all their aspirations of a future seemed to be gone because of the cross, and nothing had worked out as they had thought, and they were going to be hunted down both by the Jews and perhaps by the Romans. And when they met this stranger on the road, and he explained to them how how they had misinterpreted things, and once they realized who this was, that this is the resurrected Christ, well, suddenly everything, the way that they looked at and understood everything, it all changed. The circumstances didn't change. Most of them were still hunted down by the Jews and the Romans, and they were still persecuted, and nothing had really changed in the circumstances, but their whole outlook changed because of that hope. So sorry, I'll leave it there if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, no, and I'm just reflecting as you talk that we'd intended to do this the other way around, where Arthur was kind of outlining the challenge that's in front of us in a sense, and then I was coming in afterwards with speaking about hope. It's not been ideal doing it back to front, but so actually, thank you, Daniel, for drawing that together for us, because that is kind of where we were going with this and what we intended. Pauline.
I just wanted to say how I like the idea of the active hope rather than the passive hope, and also rather than, I think a lot of people are feeling, I use the word overwhelmed by the scale of it and the idea of, well, what little bit can I do? As I just, in my small way, just keep plugging away. One thing I'm really pleased about, which is absolutely, you'll think, oh, for goodness sake, the woman's balmy. Tesco have stopped using glitter on their cards and wrapping paper and tags, and I've written to them and congratulated them. I also want them to sponsor some goods for the Women's Refuge, but I did start with congratulating them on removing the glitter. And along those lines, I do as you know, I do poetry, and each quarter I do a poem for the Mothers Union roundabout, and the last one was not using glitter on cards. And so small steps, but mine are tiny.
It's important to celebrate the small steps, isn't it? And because small steps add up, and yes. it's all part of a growing awareness of what's important and what's not important. And you're also reminding me of another author that I actually didn't make it into my presentation, but a guy called Paulo Freire, Latin American theologian, and he talks about a positive feedback between feeling hopeful and action, and how getting started on a small thing actually helps us to feel more hopeful, which actually helps us to take the next step, which helps us to feel so it's got this positive feedback to it, whereas if we're just kind of stuck in our despair and we don't dare take that first step, then that also doesn't feed our hope, which doesn't help us. So we have to choose to take that first step, and then the positive feedback comes from that. So that kind of all came to mind, Pauline, from how you're talking, and that active hope.
Prayer is not a passive thing for me.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's not something you just tag on to the end of the day. It's got to result your prayer, because I hate to link myself with Christ, but he always prayed before he did anything. He didn't just pray; he prayed and then did something. And this is I think, we're trying to walk in his footsteps, etc. And I think this is important, that we don't just sort of sit and say, well, I've prayed about it, but actually to physically get up and do something.
Yes, absolutely.
One of my favourite sayings, not vaguely spiritual, is the optimism of action is better than the pessimism of thought.
Yes.
Doing something, and there are organisations like Hope for the Future, who I do quite a lot with now in trying to get alongside our politicians. That's a Christian organisation based in Yorkshire. Maybe need to think a bit about them sometime.
Cool, thank you, Jerry. Elizabeth, I can see your hand.
Yeah, hi, Arthur. Thank you very much. It was incredibly moving in many ways. And can I just ask you, without being too personal, is that your overall belief, or are you just trying to share with us the sort of pessimism that is out there?
Well, I wouldn't be an enthusiast for the environment if that was my entire belief.
Sure.
Because I've been at this all my life, and I'm nearly 70 now, so I count myself as an eco warrior or something like that. But I'm trying to steer this group, if you're willing to go there, into uncharted territory, which is where the average member of our Church of England, for example, would be sitting. Because I'm a bit concerned that we're so far out ahead that we're missing out on the dialogue. And I think that whilst we think that there's a lot of people out there who are interested in the environment, and it's true, particularly younger people, there's equally an awful lot of people who are sceptical, and I'd like to win them over. And I think it's a job for all of us.
Mm.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Mm. Yeah, I know it's something you've been digging into the last couple of years, isn't it, Arthur? Just exploring where climate skeptics are coming from, and just trying to find the ins on that conversation, which for those of us who are kind of, we worked this through a long time ago, it's actually quite hard to go back there and to have those conversations. Yeah. Sorry, somebody else was speaking. To see who it was. Ernest.
It's Ernest again. I'm sorry to keep speaking. I just wanted to agree with Pauline, and yes, if she hadn't said it, the active hope for me is more important than the passive hope. I'd like to have both of them, and I liked your idea of little steps, Pauline. But the image came to me while you were saying it, of that's the sort of thing you're doing when you set off along the runway to do the high jump. You do lots of little ones, or the hop, skip and jump, or the pole vault. You take little steps, but you accelerate, and then you take a giant leap. And I think that's what we've got to do. Lots of little steps are great, but we've got to start accelerating, and we need to make a giant leap. Otherwise, I'm afraid we won't win the race or win the gold medal, whatever.
My feeling is that we are society around the world, maybe not equally, but generally, is accelerating. And so we might not be accelerating as fast as we need to be, but we are accelerating. I think great strides have been made, and I think we've passed that tipping point, or whatever they call, that bit where it feels like, certainly as Greta would say, she's sort of getting nowhere, but you get to a point where suddenly it takes on a new emphasis and it becomes a more general conversation. So I think we shouldn't necessarily feel we're not getting anywhere, because I think there is progress.
Mm. I would share that. I think that this is just over the last couple of years gone way up the agenda. Doesn't mean that everybody's got it. So Arthur's reminder that there are some people who are really not in the same book, let alone the same page. That's also true. But in terms of getting towards the majority that are beginning to take this seriously, I think the situation is very different now from even 5 years ago.
There'll be a big leap forward this afternoon.
Won't there indeed? Won't there indeed? Absolutely. Yeah, the US back in on the international climate agreements and all of that kind of thing.
But COVID-19 to some extent is getting in the way.
Yes.
So we've also learned from COVID to live differently.
Yes.
It's a long time since we filled our car up with diesel.
We've learned some skills that will stay with us.
Yeah.
We've learned how to do Zoom. We've learned how to meet without all getting in our cars to do it. So I think there's wins and losses in that one. Setting aside the kind of the literal losses in terms of human life, but in terms of this conversation, wins and losses. It's good to be aware of both, I think.
But this could be a huge opportunity that God's going to take and use to refocus the world. So COVID, although it is dreadful in just about every way, could actually be the means through which God turns the world around.
Yeah, by which we're not saying God brought it.
No,
but
absolutely not.
God uses God uses what happens. Absolutely.
Yeah. We brought it around, you know,
yes, agreed.
The way we live, but God could use it for good.
Yeah, agreed.
Well, we're coming up to past, Kate. Do you think we should keep going, or could I just ask permission? This conversation has been really helpful, I've found. I've kept the recorder going, but if anybody doesn't want it to go on the website, please let me know and I'll edit out whatever your contribution was.
That's fine.
Perhaps if anybody objects and would rather not say, then drop Arthur an email.
Drop an email, yeah.
Otherwise, we'll assume that it's all okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I personally would like to thank you both. I think it's been amazing, truly amazing. Thank you.
Good. It's lovely to meet with you. I've missed the last few meetings, so it's good to be back.